Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for Europe as a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. It was on May the 9th, 1950, at 6 p.m., when the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in Paris in which he laid the foundation for the European house where today 450 million Europeans live together in peace. This was, in my book, the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched the European movement for peace and unity that's led to today's European Union. Now, while the story of the origins of the European Union usually focuses on the political and the economic dimensions, what is usually forgotten is the spiritual or religious dimension. And our guest this month has written at least 3 books on the relationship between the political and the spiritual. So I want to welcome Dr. David Koyzis, who is an academic political scientist with a PhD in government and international studies from the University of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, as they say in North America, taught political science at Redeemer University College for 30 years, that's in Canada, mentoring hundreds of young people who've gone on to contribute to public life in Canada and elsewhere. Now, he's written the following 3 books. Um, that is The Political Visions and Illusions. I have a copy of it with me as well, and it's a book that we use in our own courses, along with 2 other books. That is We Answer to Another and Citizenship Without Illusion. And I interviewed David 4 years ago, and you can find that recording still online with Schuman Talks. If you go to YouTube and then Schuman Talks and David Koyzis, you'll find that interview. And that's where he goes into more depth concerning the issues he deals with in Political Visions and Illusions. So we're going to concentrate more on the other 2 books. And so I want to say welcome, David, back to our the Schuman Talks this month.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
And as I said, we're going to be looking at your books. But firstly, I'm intrigued by your self-description as a Byzantine Rite Calvinist. And I know that you have a Cypriot background. I believe you were born in Canada, but your parents came from Cyprus. Is that correct?
No, that's not quite correct. I was actually born in the United States, just outside of Chicago. That's where I grew up. My mother is an American. My father was born in the island of Cyprus in the Greek Orthodox community there. He attended a school in Larnaca, Cyprus, that was run by Reformed Presbyterians from the United States, and that's how he came into the Reformed tradition of Christianity.
Okay. And so you still consider yourself a Byzantine Rite? I mean, do you attend an Orthodox church? Are you a member of an Orthodox church?
No, no, I'm actually a member of a Christian Reformed church, and but the Byzantine Rite Calvinist is a tongue-in-cheek moniker that I adopted about 30 years ago, and is now attached to my blog. It's a blog that I started back in 2003. It is called Notes from a Byzantine Rite Calvinist.
Okay, yes, I do. I have come across your blog, but I see you have a flag, a Ukrainian flag behind you. So, um, for a lot of evangelicals, it's starting to explore a whole new world, getting to grips with the religious background of Ukraine. But you've had a head start on most of us.
Yeah, it's something that I find quite interesting. That unfortunately the Achilles heel of Orthodox Christianity is the ethnic nationalism that is so often associated with various churches. In North America, you have overlapping ethnic jurisdictions: Romanian, Russian. There's something called the Orthodox Church in America. The Ukrainian Orthodox. Here in Hamilton, we have Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but we also have Ukrainian Greek Catholic churches as well. And these are churches that have that use the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, but they are in communion with Rome, and they have been for centuries. But if you were to go into one of the churches, you might not be able to tell the difference between the Orthodox and the Greek Catholic churches, except that the Greek Catholic churches have prayers for the Pope, and they're in communion with Rome.
Yes, yes.
Um,
Now, before we come back to your books, can you
mm.
just briefly comment on what you think evangelicals should learn from the Orthodox tradition?
Well, I think there, the sheer antiquity of the tradition is something that I think all of us could learn from. I think there are practices that are preserved from very ancient times that we might want to pay attention to. But it's also true that in many respects the liturgy um, has become so fixed that it's very difficult to change. And that's something that's quite different from, for example, the Roman Catholic Church. There were a series of changes that took place after the Second Vatican Council 60 years ago, vernacular liturgies and so forth. Now, the Orthodox have always had vernacular liturgies in some
Mm.
sense. The Greeks have the admittedly it's in New Testament Greek, their liturgy. The Russians have Old Church Slavonic, a very ancient language that's closely related to Bulgarian. So there have been liturgies in the vernacular for a long time amongst the Orthodox. So in that respect, they're probably similar to Reformation churches. If There's probably something that we would not want to take from the Orthodox, and I think that's the ethnic designation of the churches. And I think that's something that we need to be very, very careful about to try to identify the kingdom of God with a particular ethnic group.
Yes. Okay. Well, thanks for that. Let's go back to your books again. And it seems like
Yeah, yeah,
you've kind of roughly produced a book per decade.
yeah,
Political Visions and Illusions was 2003, I believe. And
yes.
then We Answer to Another, 2014, and roughly a decade later. And then Citizenship Without Illusions, more recently, just 2 years ago, if I'm correct.
Just last year, just a year ago.
Last year.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, briefly remind us what your theme was really for Political Visions and Illusions, and then what you have developed since then.
Yeah, political visions and illusions. I started writing in the mid 1990s, and it took me 7 years to write the first edition of the book. There is since then there's a second edition that came out in 2019, and the thesis of that book is that the classic modern political ideologies that we are all familiar with, conservatism, liberalism, socialism, nationalism, and so forth, are all manifestations of a very ancient phenomenon of idolatry. And idolatry means that we take something out of the creation, God's creation, and try to make a god out of that. So the boundary between creator and creation, we try to breach that boundary by taking something that God has created, and it's a genuine good, and to try to make too much of it. And that's something that each of these political ideologies tries to do in some fashion. The difference between the first and the second editions is that in the second edition, I deal with I treat the redemptive narratives, the salvation story that's told by each of the ideologies, and in that respect, they mimic the biblical redemptive narrative, and each of them tries to secure an earthly salvation through our own efforts.
So let's take capitalism and liberalism as what. So, what are the goods that are being absolutized there?
Yeah. Yeah, liberalism, capitalism, I do deal with that. It's a term that I generally prefer to avoid because it has a certain kind of baggage that carries with it that is attached to Marxism and so forth. But if it's the economic side of liberalism, which I think that's a fair designation,
Yeah.
liberalism makes too much of individual liberty, individual freedom, and I think that's where we the it tries to reduce the 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 sheer diversity of communities in which we are embedded, and to try to make them all into mere voluntary associations. So the
And
state, beginning with Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the state is conceived as simply a voluntary association of sovereign individuals, and they can make of it what they desire. The same can be said of marriage. The same can be said of family, and uh, significantly for Christians, I think the church itself, the institutional church, becomes not an institution but a mere voluntary association of like-minded individuals who like to worship in a particular way.
So it's freedom without God rather than freedom under God.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to put it. Yes.
Okay, and then nationalism.
Nationalism makes too much of the nation. And there are many ways that we can define nation. You know, we might define it politically, in which case members of the nation all carry the same passport, have the same citizenship. Sometimes nationality is described as common culture, ethnicity. I'm thinking of the 2002 film My Big Fat Greek Wedding, and
Yeah,
the colorful character Gus Portokalos, played by the late actor Michael Constantine, and I swear in some respects I think the character was modeled on my late father. You know that the Greeks invented everything. You know,
yeah, yeah,
you give me
that's
any
right.
word, I give you the Greek root.
Yes.
You know, so you know ethnicity is described in that sense. You know that everybody who shares in this culture, who shares the language, the cuisine, the
Mhm.
maybe even the Greek Orthodox faith are part of this larger nation. So you know, and
Yeah,
there's nothing wrong with that. But if we make too much of that,
yeah,
if we try to exalt our nation above other nations and claim that you
yeah,
know if you're not Greek, well you know you're part of a second class citizenry, if you will, and you know
yeah,
that's the sort of thing that we want to avoid.
yeah. And of course, Ruski Mir, the Russian emphasis, or even MAGA, the American version of that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of different cultures have been guilty of this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's
Okay, and then
toxic.
you go on to talk about, are there any Christian perspectives that are helpful?
Yeah. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the last part of the book I spent talking about two traditions which I think have been especially helpful in allowing us to make our way through the distortions of the political ideologies. One of these is the tradition of Catholic social teaching that goes back centuries, but really came about in its mature form beginning in the late 19th century with Pope Leo the 13th. Of course, the current Pope is named Leo the 14th, and he was born about 12 miles away from where I was born.
Is that right?
Uh, yeah, that's right, and he's also the first pope to be younger than I am as well. So it's but as soon as he adopted that name, I knew exactly why he was doing that.
Yes.
That
Hmm.
he was looking to Leo the 13th, who articulated in a very cogent way these Catholic social teachings that have been picked up by virtually all of his successors, especially Pius the 11th in the 1930s, and then Pope John Paul II from 1978 up until his death in 2005.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Now,
and then the second tradition is the Reformed tradition that's associated with especially with Abraham Kuyper in the Netherlands in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You know, and both of those traditions are significant because they emphasize what I call the pluriformity of society, the pluriformity of society, or the pluriformity of authorities, as I expressed it in my second book, We Answer to Another. In other words, our societies are diverse in the sense that there are communities in which we are embedded. And each of those communities has its own structure. It has its own character, its own unique character that cannot simply be reduced to arms of the state or as simply voluntary associations that have been put together by individuals. We need to take the pluriformity of society seriously, and none of the political ideologies that is on offer today does that. And that's why I think we need to go back to Catholic social teachings. We need to go back to the Reformed tradition of Abraham Kuyper and his successors. And Kuyper and his successors are the ones that have been most influential on my own work.
now I'm glad you're picking up on this theme of pluralism, and perhaps we'll come back to it later on.
Yeah.
But it is a question for a lot of Christians who wonder, well, how can Christianity be compatible with pluralism. Surely we have to insist that everybody comes under the lordship of Jesus. And
Yeah, yeah,
a lot of the well-meaning efforts these days
yeah.
to re-Christianize our society and
Right.
take our cities for
Yeah,
Jesus, etc., etc. And a lot of Christians who've been involved with the Trump movement feel this has got to be it. We got to bring people back into
right.
obeying God and the law. But perhaps that will that be a theme that you come back to as you talk about the other two books?
Well, I can come back to that, yes, but I think we need to make a distinction between what I call pluriformity and the pluralism of different beliefs in society. So what I'm emphasizing, especially in my first book, is this pluriformity of society, that this diversity that we see, the structural diversity, the various kinds of communities of which we are a part. Now the pluralism of different beliefs, that's a separate issue. It's related, but it's a distinct issue that I think needs to be treated to be treated separately. So that's I think what I'm going to say at this point. But we can come back to that when I talk about my third book.
Yeah, I think it's very important for us to realize that, firstly, government is about justice for all,
Absolutely.
and the cornerstone is freedom of conscience. And so that's justice for everybody, not just for Christians, but justice
That's
for
exactly
all.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, it's true.
So we'll move on then to and yeah, by the way, you're talking about Abraham Kuyper. I'm speaking to you right now from Prince Hendrikade in the heart of Amsterdam. And
Oh,
he
yes.
lived at 173, Prince Hendrikade. I'm
Oh,
living at 49, Prince Hendrikade. And he would
you're
walk
just down
right
the
past
street.
this building here to go to his newspaper office. And it's only about 500 meters from, or less than 500 meters in the church where he made his famous statement that there's not one single square inch
Yeah.
where Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not say mine. So yeah, we're in Cowper country here.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's marvelous. I'm glad you told me that. I'm pleased to hear
Yeah.
it.
So let's go to we answer to another. Do you want to do it in chronological order? Or?
Oh, of course. Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
we answer to another 2014. That was about 10 years, 11 years after your first book.
that's right. Yeah, and this is actually it provides a foundation for my first book. So if you're reading my books, then you might want to start with We Answer to Another, because
Mm.
it's about authority. And authority is something that there are a lot of misconceptions about in the modern world. One of the men on whom I wrote my dissertation was a Frenchman by the name of Yves René Simon, who taught at Notre Dame, my alma mater, for the 10 years between 1938 and 1948. He was one of these refugees from Europe just before the beginning of the Second World War, and he made an observation in his books on authority that authority has had a bad reputation since 1789, which is the year that
Mm.
the French Revolution started. We are more likely to be aware of the abuses of authority, but I think what we tend to miss is that authority is something that we cannot escape. It's all around us. That it's authority is something that is given us by God, and I think that is the primary meaning of the biblical notion of the image of God. Now, there are just a few places in the Bible where we read about the image of God. The image of God, I would say, is a grant of authority to God's human creation, authority over ourselves, authority over the larger creation in which He has embedded us. It's authority over other people in specific differentiated contexts. Okay, it's not just a general authority over other people, but it's authority that's connected with offices that we hold within various communities of which we are a part. So I used to go into my class, and I would ask my students, who has authority in this class? And they would all point to me. Okay, you, Professor Koyzis, you're the one with authority. And I would say, you are right, but that's not a complete answer. The answer is incomplete, because you as students have an authoritative office in this classroom as well. And it's an office that I am obligated to respect. because authority pervades communities. It's not just the hierarchy that has authority, but everybody has an authoritative office. And we are about, it's not an egalitarian conception of authority, because authoritative offices differ. Okay, and it is true that in specific contexts we are under the authority of certain office holders. So in the classroom, I had the students were under my authority. They had an authority as well, but it was a derived authority from the authority of the professor, of the instructor. But outside of the classroom, I no longer had authority over them. I couldn't tell them what to eat for supper in the evening. I couldn't tell them whom to marry. I couldn't tell them where they should work once they graduate. So it's a limited authority. And all human authority derived from God is a limited authority that is placed on the office by God himself and is constrained by other authorities as well.
Can you comment on, um, in the light of that, what changed at the Reformation? What was the picture of authority from the medieval Catholic Church, and what emerged out of especially the Reformed tradition?
That's right. Yeah, there was much more of a hierarchical conception of authority, with the church itself structured hierarchically. There was a kind of authority with God at the top. You had the church underneath God. You had the state, or the king, if you will, underneath that. You had nobility. You had commoners beneath that. Much more of a hierarchical conception of authority. In the Catholic tradition, subsidiarity was proposed as a way of trying to mitigate the hierarchical conception of authority, to indicate that even at the lower levels there is genuine authority at that level. The Reformation changed that, however, by indicating that the authority for the family comes not from the state through the church, but directly from God. The authority of the state comes directly from God. The authority from the church comes directly from God as well. So that's what we see in the notion that Abraham Kuyper proposed, that he called soevereiniteit in eigen kring in the Dutch language, sphere sovereignty, or sovereignty in its own sphere. And that's a one version of this pluriformity of authorities. That's the term that I prefer to use to describe this, that the various structures that we see in society owe their authority directly to God.
Okay, now your book also has a critique of the sovereignty of autonomy.
Yeah.
Where does the state get its authority from?
Well, the state derives its authority from God, but now that does not in any way exclude proximate office holders. Okay, so I mean, there's a sense in which we can say that in a democratic country, the authority of the state comes from its citizens. But the authority of citizens, I would say, comes from God. Okay, but through the community of the state. Citizenship, to be a citizen, means that we are members, active members of a particular state community. So I am a citizen of Canada. I'm not part of the government of Canada, but I am a citizen of the Canadian state, if we can put it in those terms. And as a citizen, I am subject to the laws of the state where I am living. I'm subject to the laws of the state of which I'm a citizen. But that citizenship is something that I believe that ultimately comes from God.
Now, you've given a Christian understanding of the authority of the state, but what happens if you take God out of the picture?
Well, if you take God out of the picture, then somebody else is going to claim sovereignty. It might be citizens. We might claim that citizens are sovereign. We might claim that a particular government is sovereign. In international relations, we talk about the sovereignty of particular nation states. We can talk about Canadian sovereignty as opposed to the interference of some other country, for example. And so that term is used. Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II was called the Sovereign, and now her son Charles III is titled the Sovereign. That's a title that is given to him relative to the 15 Commonwealth realms, which recognize him as their king, including Canada. But ultimately, I would say that sovereignty in the unmitigated sense can only belong to God Himself, and other sovereigns, other claims to authority, have an authority that is given to them by God, even if they fail to recognize it.
Okay. And then how does this relate to law then? Because what's the authority behind the law?
Well, once again, I think the authority behind law is God Himself. This is something that political philosophers, legal philosophers have been arguing about, debating for centuries. Where does authority for law come from? If it comes solely from the people, then the people can make whatever laws they want, even if they oppress minorities, ethnic or however you would describe them. But the Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms actually begins with a recognition of God, and that's something that the U.S. Constitution does not do. But the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, now whether we really believe it or not here in
Yeah.
Canada, that's another issue. But it is in the document, and a number of constitutional documents do begin that way with a recognition of the higher authority of God.
Now, in our secularized nations, though,
Yeah.
that's not the way things are run.
No, that's right.
What's the alternative then? If we don't, what's law rooted in if it's not
Yeah.
rooted in God?
Well, I think that's where the various ideologies come in that I treat in my first book, because people who have different ultimate beliefs are going to have different beliefs as to where the law originates. But because of something that Kuyper called common grace, there's a kind of common grace that God has given to all of His creatures. Whether we recognize it or not, there's a common grace. There's a tremendous amount of overlap that enables us to live together despite our differences in our ultimate beliefs under a single legal framework. And I think that's due to God's common grace.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Um, but then, well, we'll try to look at today's situation in the light of some of these concepts. But this is the theme of your book, um, and you also you talk about the place of obedience, and is there any role for resistance?
Yeah, there has to be. There has to be. And in my third book, Citizenship Without Illusions, I do deal with that in a more detailed way. I actually wrote something for Christianity Today. It was their cover story about 10 years ago, I think it was, on civil disobedience. When is it proper to to disobey a government? And I lay out criteria that I think we need to take into account. You can read that in the chapter. When kingdoms collide is the name of one of the chapters in Citizenship Without Illusions. And there have been people who have resisted. One of my best friends is a man by the name of Al Wolters, who wrote a book called Creation Regained, and
Mm.
he was I count him as one of my mentors. He was very influential on me. I think if it had not been for his book Creation Regained, I think my own books I think would look quite different. When he was born in 1942 in the middle of the German occupation of the Netherlands, and he lived in the town of Enschede, the Netherlands, which is right on the border with Germany. And his parents hid a Jewish family in their attic. A very dangerous thing to do, but they were defying the occupying authorities of the Netherlands at the time. And there were a lot of people who did that. A lot of people were, and we'll never know the number of Dutch people, Dutch Christians in particular, who hid Jewish families in their houses to try to protect them from the Nazis, who would have sent them to a death camp and almost certain death. And it was dangerous for them to do because it was dangerous for their children as well, and they had a number of close calls, and that's the sort of thing that I that uh, in times of crisis, many Christians decided, without telling people, because you didn't want to tell people what you were doing at any particular time, to defy the authorities. One of my students from about 20 years ago, he had a great uncle who was in the Dutch resistance, and he was sent to an internment camp in the north of the Netherlands, and he ended up dying there at the age of 24. So there have been Christians down, and I could talk about Dr. Martin Luther King as well, who in the 1950s and the 1960s was fighting to secure the long denied rights of Black Americans in that country.
Yes, well, of course, we can find lots of biblical precedent for that. And of course, in the book of Acts, we must obey God rather than man. And in
Exactly.
fact, the Dutch Republic and thus the Netherlands would never have come into existence had it not been for William of Orange picking up
Yes, that's
Calvin's teaching on this and saying
exactly.
it's not only a responsibility, it's a duty, or that that when kings move beyond their God-given authority, there needs to be resistance. And in fact, nobody ever sat down to think, hey, we need to see a country called the Netherlands come into being. It
That's
was
right.
totally unplanned as a result of responding to tyranny.
That's
And
right. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
more tyrannical Spain was, the stronger the resistance of the Dutch. And I think there's lots of lessons
Yeah.
for Ukraine right now,
Right.
in terms of encouragement to keep resisting, to keep
Right.
responding, and push through, because there were several
Right.
key moments in Holland's history where Holland could have disappeared. But
Of course.
because of this, with this biblical justification, consciously,
Yeah.
the nation of the Netherlands emerged. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So that's we answer to another, laying the foundation for both your other
Yeah.
books.
Yeah.
Let's go on to Citizenship Without Illusion.
Citizenship Without Illusion started a few years ago when a good friend of mine in North Carolina, he was teaching at a Baptist seminary at which I had guest lectured on occasion. In the middle of a telephone call, he said, "David, I think you should write a book about citizenship." Now, this man, I have a great deal of respect for him, and he has a lot of good advice, and he knows me pretty well, and so I took his advice, and I decided, okay, I'm gonna take that up. So in I think it was late 2022, um, I submitted a proposal to University Press. They are the publisher of my first book, Citizenship Without Illusions. While I was dealing with a bout of COVID at the same time, and also a bout of frozen shoulders, so I was quite a bit of pain when I was preparing this proposal. I sent it to IVP, and shortly after Christmas, January of 2023, they agreed to publish the book. Now, my first two books, each of them took 7 years to write. This one, because I was retired and did not have other responsibilities, only took me a few months to write. So by the end of 2023, I was actually able to send the completed draft to the publisher. This book arose because readers of my first book, I did get negative reviews of the first book, but a lot of times people were blown away by the first book, and they would say, "Wow, I had never thought about all this before. What do I do with this? How do I put this into practice?" So, Citizenship Without Illusions, the illusions in that title is an allusion to illusions in the title of the first book, and I tried to provide practical advice for people as to how to work out their citizenship as Christians, living in mostly Western polities, but also other polities as well. I have a lot of readers in Brazil. I love Brazilians; they're just a wonderful, wonderful people. And my first book was translated into Portuguese, and so there was I wanted to take their situation into account as well. How do we live as Christians in our earthly polities? And it's not a fundamentally different question than how do we live as Christians within the world of business, or within the world of the arts, or within the world of athletics, for example. These are it's fundamentally the same question. Now, as I was writing this book, I found myself focusing more than I had intended on local action rather than the national level. Because at the national level, you as an individual are less likely to be able to make an impact
Mm-hmm.
unless you are organized with other individuals, large numbers of individuals, maybe a political movement or political party of some sort, to be able to have an impact on the national level. But it's more likely at the local level, in your own community, in your own town, your own city, village, that you are more likely to see the results of your activities. So I found myself, until I guess the last but one chapter, focusing more on local action than I had thought I was going to do when I first proposed the book.
Okay, so and indeed, most of us are involved. Yeah, much we vote for the national elections, etc., etc. But
Yeah,
most of our activities are in our own communities, of course. Um, so let's ask ourselves then, how can these books shed light on knowing how we should be engaging today in a highly polarized society? Uh, Wherever we are in Europe or in North America, there are these tendencies, and in some places worse than others.
right,
Um, how can you? How do your books shed light on how we understand the times in which we're living? What is actually going
right.
on? Uh, I mean, a lot has happened since you and I talked 4 years ago.
Yes, indeed.
And if somebody had said, "Well, this is what's going to happen, and America's going to threaten to take over Greenland, and has already moved into
Yeah,
Venezuela, etc.,
yeah,
etc., according to plans that seem to have been around for 7 or 8 years,"
yeah.
um, would we believe that? So, how do
No.
your books help us understand what's going on?
I think what we're seeing now is that the various ideologies are playing out in our respective polities. People are unable to see that the ideologies give them a distorted vision of the world and of their societies. They are so persuaded of the truth of their particular ideologies, and they are running with them, irrespective of what other people might think. Opponents now have become enemies, enemies
Yeah.
to be defeated rather than negotiated with and to be heard out. And I think that's it has made our political communities much more toxic, and that's a very bad thing.
Yes. How uh, you're sitting there in Canada,
Yeah,
um, just across the border from America, and
right.
what's going through your mind as Canadians right now as to
Yeah,
what your future looks like?
yeah. Um, the well, we don't like what we're seeing, very obviously. I've lived in Canada since 1987. There were 2 years in the late 1970s that I spent in Toronto as well, so it's about 40 years that I've spent in Canada, as opposed to 30 years in the United States. The United States does not look like the same country that I left behind in the 1980s. And I'm very sorry to say that. I think a lot of that has to do with the abolition of the fairness doctrine by the Federal Communications Commission south of the border, open up the airwaves to, I can only call them hate mongers, if you will, on the pretext of freedom of speech. And I think that's helped to poison the discourse in the United States. I think it's worsened considerably since the beginning of the century. In 2000, when George W. Bush and Al Gore were running against each other, their debates were very gentlemanly.
Yes, yes.
They were sitting around a table, and more often than not, they agreed with each other, but they differed on the ways to get to the goals that they had in common. I don't think that's the case anymore. A quarter of a century later, things have changed and they have not gotten better. I'm sorry to say. I hope that my books will be able to get people, Christians in particular, but if non-Christians want to read my books, they're certainly welcome to do that, to think through some of the things that are happening in the United States and elsewhere as well.
Now, what puzzles a lot of us who are watching from a distance
Yeah,
is that Christians seem to have been very much involved in promoting the current leadership.
yeah,
And yet,
yeah.
what has gone wrong? What should they have picked up from your books to prevent this from happening?
Well, the being a Christian does not make you immune to the temptations of political ideologies. And sometimes what happens is that if we come to see through the defects of one ideology, we tend to flee to another ideology. It's not the same, but it's an ideology all the same. It's still a distorted understanding of the way that our societies work. Nationalism sounds good. America first, make America great again. But nationalists put too much emphasis on the state. They put too much emphasis on the state, as being the representative of the nation, whereas in reality, a nation is simply an aggregation of the pluriform structures in a diverse society. And to say that any one community represents the nation as a whole, that's a very dangerous thing.
Now, I recently had a fine American Christian say to me, but we had no choice if we had not voted for Trump, who was the anti abortion candidate, we would have had
Right,
blood on our hands. How would you answer that?
right, right, right. Um, I am somewhat sympathetic to those who reason that way, because of the electoral system that we have in most English-speaking democracies. New Zealand is an exception now, and it has been since the 1990s. But a kind of a first past the post system, political scientists call a single-member plurality system. It tends to favor two parties. And the United States is probably the best, maybe the worst example of that in practice. If a political party, a third party, if its support base is too geographically diffuse, then basically there are only two parties that you're going to be able to vote for. And so typically in our political systems in English-speaking democracies, we have to hold our noses when we go into the polling place and vote for the party that we think will do the least harm. And that's one of the chapters of my newest book is How to Vote. I don't have any really definitive answers for people who are confronted with intolerable choices. And I think, especially in the United States, the choices in recent years have been intolerable. How do you vote in that kind of a context? And I don't have good answers for. Maybe all we could do is to try to mitigate um, the certain harm that will be done by one of the political parties. Now, for those people who are I am pro-life myself. Our daughter was born at 26 weeks, which is very early. Just a little bit more than 3 months early. She was in NICUs, neonatal intensive care units, for 10 and a half weeks after she was born, 1998, 1999. And it was a scary thing, and we experienced her humanity at that young age. She would smile when she should have been in the womb, when she was satisfied. So I'm definitely pro-life, but but sometimes people who are pro-life think, well, I am willing to risk bringing down the system that enables us to get along with each other, for the sake of my pro-life convictions. And I think that it's wrong, because it doesn't take seriously the importance of political community and political authority in a diverse society. So we need to take into account our constitutions. We need to take into account our political institutions. We need to respect them, even if they make decisions that we don't like and we think are going to be harmful. We need to support our political institutions and our political systems because they allow us to get along with each other. There was a British political scientist by the name of Sir Bernard Crick. He died about I think it was about 2008. I think it was. He wrote a book called In Defense of Politics back in 1962. I would have my students reading that book because it's very important. He talks about how politics is is a way of conciliating diversity within a particular unit of rule, and politics is irreplaceable. It's just an excellent book. It went through about maybe 5 or 6 editions. He never really revised the first chapters. He kept on adding chapters as they would go into new editions to deal with issues that had arisen in the meantime. But it's an excellent book. To read it. He was not a Christian, but I think he was on the mark in understanding the true character of politics and how politics enables people who disagree with each other to be able to get along with each other for proximate political purposes.
Well, let me ask you this question since you're living in North America. Um, it would seem that there are a number of people from the MAGA movement who are realizing we've really released a monster. We've
Yeah.
backed the wrong horse,
Yes.
and
Exactly.
beginning to say so. Do you see anything equivalent in the evangelical world of those who have been strongly supportive of President Trump changing their minds and being vocal about that?
Yes, I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, I can't give you any examples right now. I know that in the circles that I traveled in the States, most of my evangelical friends were appalled by Donald Trump. They didn't like him one bit, even as they may have had um, uh, um, qualms about the Democratic Party. And don't get me wrong. I think the Democratic
Yeah,
Party has become toxic in its own way, especially since the beginning of the 21st century. There used to be pro-life Democrats. There used to be Democrats who the sincere Christians that were. I can think of Senator Paul Simon from my home state of Illinois. A devout Lutheran, and I had a great deal of respect for him. And he was a part of the Democratic Party. Stephen Monsma was in the Michigan State Legislature. He had taught at Calvin College, and he was with the Democratic Party. A devout Reformed evangelical Christian. And I had he's gone now, but I had a great deal of respect for him.
hmm
And
hmm
and I always made sure that we talked when we were at conferences together and so forth. People like that. I in my new book, I put a sentence in there that I thought would be flagged by the reviewers, and I said that the Republicans and the Democrats have become diseased parodies of their former selves. And I thought, sure, somebody would say, "Oh, Koyzis, you can't put that in a book that's going to sell." But nobody touched it. Not the
hmm
anonymous reviewer, not my editor, not the people at IVP at University Press. They left it in there because I think a lot of people recognize that that's the truth of what I said. And I don't know what's going to happen. I would love to see a new movement. There's a, a political party called the American Solidarity Party that I have had some connections with. And I say, go to it. But I think they're going to have to start at the local level because you can't really start at the national level in a country of more than of hundreds of millions of people. So yeah, but I'm hoping that there will be new political movements that will be able to get off the ground.
If if you had the opportunity to address American Christians
Yeah,
who would be feeling like something's wrong, we're going the wrong direction, what would you say to them?
I would say open your eyes. Make sure that your vision is clear, And that's where, when I talk about the pluriformity of society, this is it doesn't take a tremendous amount of theoretical and philosophical acumen to look around and recognize that marriages are marriages, that families are families, that business enterprises are business enterprises, that the state is the state, that church congregations are church congregations. Because in some fashion or another, each of these ideologies tries to suppress what we should be seeing with our own eyes, and what we can, if we are not wearing the kind of clouded glasses that come with the various political ideologies. So open your eyes, keep your eyes open, see what's around you, and don't let people deceive you.
Well, that sounds like good advice for us all, David,
Yeah,
whether we live on which side of the Atlantic we live on. Well,
right.
thank you very much for this conversation. And I hope we've whetted some people's appetites to order your books and read these books and apply the insights from them. I want to thank you very much, David, and I hope to have you back sometime for a further conversation on a Schuman Talk. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and I was happy to be here.
Great. Well, next month we are going to explore something, some of the social theology or the public theology um, coming out of Ukraine, and particularly that of Andrei Sheptytsky. And we'll have two experts on Sheptytsky from the university, Catholic University in Lviv, where there is a center on Sheptytsky. Sheptytsky was, for me, a real discovery this last year to his teachings, so much applied in the nitty gritty of Ukraine as it was being suppressed under Stalin, particularly during the Holodomor, that is the forced starvation of so many Ukrainians, millions of them. And he has, from what I've been reading of his material, he has some very helpful insights for us in these days. And I'm looking forward to having that conversation next month. So we're going to sign off here, and thank you very much for being with us this evening for this conversation with David Koyzis. Thank you.